Okay, good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to our Governance Roundtable. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I'd just like to share a little bit. Basically, this is an initiative by the Asia DeFi Network, and I'm Shikai from Longhash Ventures. And today we want to facilitate an open conversation about governance. Now, just a bit of background, which I'm sure all of us are super familiar, right? We're still super early in DeFi and governance, but there's a very clear social consensus that we want to move towards like community-owned and community-governed protocols with so many benefits, as we all know, censorship resistance, anti-fragility, and so on. So in this spirit, this conversation will also be recorded and we will also share it widely after the session. And we will also be putting together a research piece based on our conversation today, as well as any points and learnings in the future from public discourse as well. And we will share that piece of research publicly too. Now, so that we can all understand the flow for today, let's pull up the agenda. We're going to have two longer sharing sessions from Aave and Synthetix. We have Stani and Jordan with us. And then after that, we're going to go through 15 minutes each from everyone's perspectives around the round table, from investor perspective, as well as Balancer, Acala, Instadapp on various decentralization journeys. So in order to make the conversation a bit more guided and structured, we have already taken the liberty to facilitate the conversation across three major buckets. Right? We want to talk about firstly the structure of governance, and then what are processes and tools, and then the engagement and incentives. So under structure, we're talking about, firstly, what do we decentralize? From the simplest level of like a pool of grants to then more complex things like maybe incentivizing some asset pools or bringing new assets to the most kind of like critical core protocol features or even governance. And we can do this via a few archetypes, be it just like very simple open proposals or having some sort of guardrails through some kind of committees or going through a very strict kind of like subcommittee or sub-DAO structure. And then to implement these proposals as well, we want to go through the various steps, be it like discussion, the proposal, iteration, and then the execution of the proposals. And finally, for the engagement and incentives, I'm going to talk about who can vote, how much voting power, what are the incentives to even vote or participate, and the softer human side of how do we encourage people to kind of join and amplify and reward people for being part of the community. So we have put together some of the questions here to guide us in each of our sharing, be it from from everyone from the roundtable. So feel free to use this as a guide, but also kind of like add in, feel free to flow with the conversation. Well, then it'll be a great pleasure to invite Stani to share with us the decentralization journey, or like the case study going deep into the governance for Aave and the approach you have taken and trade-offs and challenges that you are thinking. Over to you, Stani.
Hey everyone, happy to be here to share some experience, kind of like how was the journey of to kind of like team focused deployment of contracts into what we have now, a decentralized governance and protocol owned by the community. What's interesting about Aave as a community and as a project is that we started to build our very first protocol back in 2016, 2017. And during that time, we first focused on just creating proof of concept smart contracts and just building community around our first iterations. That was time before DeFi was what even as a term, and there wasn't much of a composability or DeFi protocols at that moment. And at some point, we started to create, as we saw that the community started to grow more, we were thinking like how we could empower the community and get them more involved and be part of what we're building. And we pretty much decided to distribute governance power. But in the beginning, what was different is that we still wanted to keep the the deployments and the governance of the protocol still in the hands of the team in the very beginning, which is quite normal. And pretty much like the main reason everyone is doing this, and especially lending protocols, is that there's quite a lot of risk involved in terms of, let's say, if there's some sort of like a technical issue, let's say some sort of a error in the smart contracts or the economics that has been implemented. The difficulty is that if there is funds in the protocol, and if the governance is from the day one, what happens is that it's very difficult to actually go and mitigate those kind of like a security vulnerabilities if those happens. And especially as kind of like a DeFi protocols are growing quite a lot. There's currently, I think, roughly 13 billion worth of value locked in the Aave protocol itself. It's the biggest DeFi protocol at the moment, and in total 21 billion, including like the accounting measures, so including the collateral in the protocol, but also the borrowed funds that is owned back to the protocol. So in that sense, the governance aspects and how you go from, let's say, would say like team owned building into something where the protocol is governed by the community, and also any improvements to the protocol is done by the community and voted upon the governance. It's very crucial journey. And what we found, especially like for lending protocols, we try to intensively mitigate any kind of technical risks involved there, and also kind of apply governance minimization wherever we can, because governance as a tool is to some extent also like burdensome, because you have a process of how you get things changed into the protocol. So what we try to usually do is that we try to let most of the kind of like a heavy lifting in the protocol and changes related to that done by more of mathematics. So let's say that we don't change interest rate formulas by governance on a periodic basis. Instead, we have a certain type of interest rate formula that is based on the market conditions, supply and demand. And for example, this allows us actually to have less governance involvement on changing that kind of like a interest rate formula. And then if there is some sort of market conditions that are unexpected, then the governance can come and change actually that particular formula. So we try to apply governance minimization wherever we can, but in certain aspects it's not doable. For example, when it comes to asset listings and assessing risks of those different kind of assets. Let's say if there's a new asset that the community wants to list, there's particular peculiarities that we need to review from risk perspective, such as the liquidity risk, technical risk of that particular asset, and also the market risk. And those kind of things you kind of require human involvement, and you can't live for mathematics or have governance minimization in that part to have kind of like a scalability on asset listing. And what we actually done with the Aave community is we created this risk framework, which actually means that anyone from the Aave community can actually suggest an asset to be listed, but with the conditions of they review the risk framework and apply it in a way that that reflects the risk parameters of that new asset reflects the risk framework. And if it's aligned, it most likely the community will vote that assets into the system. And this is like a very interesting way where you have open community managing a risk of the protocol, which is fascinating, because end of the day, these protocols vary in the future pretty much like how they manage the risk. So if there's Aave protocol, there is Maker protocol, for example, and we both have completely different kinds of risk dynamics there. So that's kind of like a key component. Like we try to use governance as least as possible, mainly for the reason of the process is quite burdensome, and try to leave everything that we can in for mathematics and automation, but where actually you need human involvement, their community based approach with the governance is very good solution. And one of the newest things that we understood during this process is that some of the functions still need human involvement and community governance, but you might need just some less burdensome mechanisms. And that might be, for example, grants. If you have a grants program in your community, you might not want to have like the same voting process as you would vote, let's say, a new asset into the protocol, change the risk parameters, or upgrade current version of the protocol to something new. Instead, you might just want to kind of like do decision making in more robust way. So what we have done is that we started to create now sub-DAOs, and one of the first sub-DAO is the Aave Grants DAO, which actually created one big proposal to the the main Aave DAO, and meaning that they requested funds, a certain amount, so that they can actually further give those funds in form of grants to the applicants that has been accepted. And this kind of like a process gives more flexibility, and then you don't need all the token holders the threshold of the token holders to vote upon, let's say, smaller things like grants, or let's say some sort of promotional efforts within the community, or educational content and related to finance, for example, and financing those efforts. So that's kind of like a model that we have followed. And I would say the challenging part for us now is to think, let's say, how in the future the protocol can be let's say upgraded into a newer version, because innovation is constant, right? So even if you have a protocol that has protocol market fit, doesn't necessarily mean that that will be always the case. So you have this constant innovation cycle where you have to keep up with, especially in decentralized finance. It's very much quick in the sense, because we have an open environment. Everyone can look at your code and actually fairly quickly take your code and improve it and create another protocol that might have more efficiency and that attracts more liquidity. In that sense, we're thinking now like how we can actually deploy new protocols and do it safely at the same time, and without kind of like having to actually then keep any kind of like administrative keys by the team, or have some sort of like a community-based key management in that sense. And in terms of the actual tactical things related to governance, I would say like governance participation is fairly good in the Aave protocol. There isn't that much like controversial votes, mainly because our governance has been structured in a way that before you usually create a AIP, so the Aave improvement proposal, first thing you actually are doing is that you create so-called requests for comments into the governance forum, governance.aave.com. That generates kind of like discussion and gives a bit of time for the community to digest the proposal. And what this essentially allows us to do is that you can temperature check the proposal and see how the community reacts. And if there's positive reactions there, there's likely a chance that that proposal will succeed and goes into the AIP part, where you actually create on-chain code, and at the same time then you put the proposal on-chain for voting for the governance. And this is kind of like important because it saves resources of not creating proposals that doesn't have success in the future. And at the same time, one of the interesting things about Aave governance is that necessarily you don't need to be a token holder to put proposals on chain. So we have not only vote delegation, so that you can delegate votes to, let's say, so-called protocol politicians, but you could, for example, delegate also proposition power separately from voting power to developers that can create proposals. This essentially creates a institution or mechanism where you have so-called like code lawmakers creating those proposals and then protocol politicians voting on them. This is some kind of like an interesting dynamic that we want to see grow in the future. Now we're trying to also figure out like how we can incentivize developers to actually kind of like create DAOs where they get the delegation, proposition power delegation, and they craft those proposals maybe against some sort of incentive or some particular relationship, and then kind of like have the separability of who create the code and who vote on the code. And that's pretty much like what is happening recently. And of course, like the gas fees are one of the issues, and of course, like Aave itself is a cross-chain environment. So we have the main layer 1 market, but then we have also the market in Polygon, in Matic, and we always try to deploy in wherever we can actually. So be as inclusive as possible when it comes to the markets and infrastructure we have. And what we're working now is that we are creating a governance bridge, which means that you can on layer 1 vote on decisions on the Matic market. So you vote on layer 1, and then with the governance bridge, those decisions are propagated into the Matic and executed. And then doing the same vice versa, so that you can vote in Matic and they're propagated into the layer 1. And this could be interesting because it decreases the actually participation cost on the governance with the gas fees. And the gas fees is actually something that we have received feedback that it's quite costly to vote on these proposals, and it definitely kind of like limits the scope of participating on these proposals. So that's kind of like a thing we are trying to solve. And of course, like we support snapshots as well. So that's one option. You basically vote off chain, and someone just puts the actual result on chain, and then we have different kinds of like fraud prevention mechanisms to deal if the proposal isn't legit. And also, like the peculiar part about Aave governance itself also is that you can vote itself on the token economics and the token itself. So the ERC20 is upgradable, but with a way higher threshold. So you need pretty much 20% of the total supply to make any kind of changes. And this is important because we know by our kind of like a previous understanding is that there will be always innovation in the token level itself. And if you are able to upgrade the token in the future with your community, it means that you don't need to do any kind of like a token migrations in the future. And you can just innovate on the token level itself as well. And good example is how tokens have governance tokens changed over time is that like during last year, many of the tokens have vote delegation, which didn't exist previously. And if your token didn't have that, that means that you have to migrate your token to a completely new ERC20. It's just a technicality, but just showcases like things that you need to consider when you build and have governance and token-based governance in a ecosystem which moves very quickly. Yeah, and I guess like one of the things that we are trying to also achieve is that we as a community members, like leaders, are trying to be more active in voting, not just in the Aave governance, but let's say in Synthetix governance and other protocols. And the idea here actually is that we believe at Aave that governance will be inclusive in the future. So even in some of the markets in Aave, you could vote with other tokens where there is some sort of a relevance. For example, we deployed AMM market where you can use Uniswap balancer and in the future SushiSwap liquidity tokens as a collateral. So it will be interesting, for example, to give some voting weight to, let's say, those tokens and also to Uni, BAL, and Sushi tokens, and kind of like create more inclusive governance and environment, because that's probably the direction we're heading towards. Besides that, this is pretty much from Aave's part, and if there's any questions now or later.
Thank you so much, Stani. Stani, if I may, one of the areas that is still, to me, I think, underdeveloped, maybe for good reason, is the whole idea of like incentivizing kind of like coming up proposals or incentivizing even voting or engagements, because it's a bit tricky to do, right? You don't want to kind of like reward something and then that ends up encouraging some weird behavior. How do you think about this? Is this even a problem? Is there actually voter apathy or lack of engagement, or is it enough already? And if so, do we still need some sort of like rewards or incentives to do so?
Yeah, I think like I guess like the base layer of whole governance has been that across decentralized finance and Web3 is that you pretty much try not to incentivize like monetarily, because you want to have governance where you have like other kind of incentives driving you towards pretty much running the agenda or supporting different agendas. But in my opinion, now that that's done, like one of the next things to experiment is actually try to experience on the level of like, what about if we actually incentivize some sort of participation on the voting level and especially in the kind of like a crafting of the on-chain proposals, the payloads itself, because those are very costly. And I think if you look at governments, for example, now, if you get into a governmental body where you have voting abilities, it's pretty much like a paid position. And I can imagine the future, if you reach certain amount of vote delegations, what happens is that based on that, you will be able to get some sort of like a cash flow from the protocols, and that will kind of like create this kind of like a competition that you are getting more proposition power or some sort of a voting activity. So that's a kind of like a development that could happen. And I think someone will pretty much come with some sort of experimentation. We haven't done it in the Aave community that much towards this direction, but I think this could be a very interesting way to get more professional, more professional and more active governance. It's a good actually topic.
Yeah, and still a lot like largely unexplored, right? Like the idea of professional politicians who are maybe deeply involved or maybe even uninterested, so that they can make an objective decision somehow on, for example, token economics, one way or the other. Yeah. If I may, Marta has a question here that she has typed out in chat. How do you think you are done, and how do you know that you are done with the decentralization and autonomy? I guess in like the setup of the governance structures.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess you're never kind of done. I mean, decentralization itself is a cost, and like, what's the balance of how much cost you add in terms of security and this for decentralization, and how much you actually need it. And you can decentralize things very widely. So let's say every token holder needs to participate to vote on every decision making, or cap delegations and snapshot that basically someone puts on chain, and you have this kind of optimistic governance. But in terms of like what's important is that once you get certain aspect of decentralization, there's always risk of centralization again. So it's kind of like a balance all the time that is moving. And I guess like if you look at back in governments and economies and how we have structured things, and even if you look at decentralized finance, end of the day, where you have actually places where you have most of the capital that attracts like the rest of the capital and governance power. So we have this kind of like a dilemma that of concentrations all the time. So how do we ensure that let's say the token holders or the community member will always kind of like try to honor the opinions of minorities? It works pretty well compared to traditional finance and economies because in DeFi, for example, in Web3, all the code is pretty much open source, which means that you can take the code and fork it and create a new community if you're not happy. Kind of similar way, for example, if you look at Linux ecosystem, if you're not happy the way people are building things, you can fork the software and create your own community. And this kind of like creates a bit of pressure of ensuring that you have wide enough consensus in your community. That could be like a substantial differentiator, what we have seen previously, where governments or any kind of like parties have seen decentralization, but goes back into centralization. So there's two things there. It's basically the balance and also how much decentralization you actually need to be sufficiently decentralized.
I didn't catch one thing about how do you deal with auditing of the smart contracts? Because you have a lot of things put in place, a lot of breakpoints put in place if it turns out that the contract was malicious or there was a bug or something. But I'm wondering, how do you deal with actually, before it's even voted on, do you verify? Is there like a subcommittee that is just responsible for security?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because like what we are leaning towards is that we will have so-called payload DAO, one of the sub-DAOs that is actually creating the payloads, but also reviewing third-party payloads. And of course, like every payload should be audited, and this is very important, because even if it's a some sort of like a risk, parameter change, it's important to audit. But also kind of like the challenge is that the community needs to somehow ensure what's sufficient auditing and what are the sufficient procedures of creating safe and secure code, because that's one of the most difficult things to do is to build smart contracts that can hold billions and in the future trillions of dollars worth of value without breaking. And how we do it, Aave, we focus quite a lot on security, but we do it internally. So we tend not to leave the security or delegate it to auditors, because we know their job is just to basically review the code and see if there's any kind of like a logical thinking that we didn't come up with, or maybe some sort of like a, maybe like a other kind of bugs. But I would say that like we have a lot of procedures internally, and how we can actually export those procedures to the whole community, and that and related to procedures, like the importance is that you follow them. So most of the procedures are related to code review and how we do code review and how we build test cases and test suites. So some of them is very relatively easy to apply, such as like creating test cases, and also you need to know what you're testing and what you need to find out. But also kind of like those review processes, like how we ensure that people who are building code and reviewing each other's code, how they're doing it well enough. And that's kind of like part of also like education, I guess, that we're able to educate our community and the whole DeFi community in general, like how to build secure protocols.
Thank you so much, Stani. And so thanks so much again for joining us and sharing your insights. Super helpful. Now, moving on to our second kind of sharing session, we also have an incredible community builder and an incredible protocol contributor, Jordan from Synthetix. So great to see you again, Jordan.
Hey everyone, good to be here. So yeah, I guess I'll just jump in and sort of talk about the Synthetix journey, some of the things that we've done, and sort of the progression that we've been on. So we began fairly decentralized, as a lot of projects do. We were quite open about that as well. Like we were quite open about that fact, and I guess being open made it a little bit easier for the community to swallow. We talked to them very early on about the trade-offs between being more decentralized and being able to move at speed. And I think one of the things that Synthetix did quite well, I guess, was move at speed. That was something that we were fairly known for, the way that we shipped. So that was kind of the place that we started. We began with a foundation, as a lot of projects did in 2017, 2018. Kane always talks about, the fact that we started with their foundation because everyone else started with the foundation. So, using and taking the heuristics of what was just acceptable at the time. How do you structure yourself in a way where you garner, the ability to, for example, raise money. If if you're just going to try to raise money through a DAO in 2018, maybe it's not so easy. So there are some practical, I guess, things to how decentralization within itself is practical, and that a lot of that is dependent on the market, the timing, and obviously what's happening around you. So all of that is to say that that we were fairly decentralized to begin with. Over the past 2 years, we've progressively become more decentralized. We sort of started with expanding the PDAO members. So the PDAO is short for the protocol DAO. The protocol DAO is essentially responsible for managing the code and the upgrades to the system. And I think maybe it's a good time to segue into sort of the model that we have relative to some others. So I think the terminology that you're using is the sub-DAO model. So we are using the sub-DAO model in that we have multiple DAOs that contribute to the overall direction of the protocol and contribute in various ways. So the protocol DAO is essentially engineers who qualify through a certain process, which has now been formalized. I won't expand on that process here, but all of these processes and I guess set of prerequisites that are necessary to be in the protocol DAO are actually publicly talked about in a SIP that we recently published. So we have a bunch of core contributors who are engineers, and based on those criteria, they essentially become members of the protocol DAO. And the protocol DAO, like I said, is the DAO that essentially manages the code and the upgrade process of the system. So that DAO used to be probably the most critical in terms of the functioning of the protocol. Since then, we've also added the grants DAO, which is responsible for funding public goods, and that DAO is actually voted on quarterly. So we have quarterly epochs where we have 5 members who petition. So in this way, we kind of have a version of representative democracy where anyone in the community can come and petition to be on the grants DAO. The grants DAO then basically has a quarterly budget, and that budget is their responsibility to use and to point in the right direction for funding of public goods, regardless of what those may be. So once those members have been voted in, they definitely have a level of autonomy to make decisions for the quarter, and essentially their decision making is used as a way for either advocating for themselves again in the next epoch, or if they've made bad decisions, then obviously token holders sort of look at those decisions as a way of kind of deciding. So kind of stepping back, the actual voting process itself is it's direct token voting, but we use a quadratic voting model where we're trying to, I guess, dilute quote unquote whales. So we want to make sure that we don't have voter apathy, and that we don't fall into a situation where users or token holders feel that they can't make a difference, that their vote doesn't matter. We actually spent a lot of time thinking about this, because there is a trade-off between making it fair for smaller participants, but also acknowledging that people that have a larger economic interest, which is the mostly the way that you would be a larger token holder, that they actually also have a commensurate sort of level of influence and decision making relative to the investment that they've made. So we thought about that, and we've kind of landed on something in the middle. I guess one of the reasons why we went with a sub-DAO model is because of the speed at which we need to change and the speed at which we need to not only make decisions, but then implement those decisions, and overall the complexity of the system. I think, like, for example, relative to Aave, I think it's fairly easy to see how high touch Synthetix is in terms of the product and in terms of what we need to do to get to product market fit. So I think the product, and I guess the maturity of the products, is a determining factor for the actual model that we went with. And it's a pretty important input, I think. Something like Uniswap, at least from our perspective or my perspective, seems much easier to be automated, because I think the parameters are somewhat defined. So I think it's quite an important point, because depending on what you're building and depending on the complexity involved and what stage you're at, I think those are really important inputs into, like, whether you go, fully open community or sub-DAO or kind of minimize governance in general. So going back to our progress, PDAO, the expansion of the members of the PDAO, the really, I guess, step change for us was introducing the Spartan Council. So having a council that, again, are voted in by token holders, and having them responsible for proposals that are made or presented by anybody. So we have an open proposal system. We don't have a minimum token number or any kind of minimum level of metrics in any way where we actually filter any proposal submissions. So anyone can propose something in the community, and then it's up to the Spartan Council to evaluate that proposal and basically vote on those proposals. So they spend time thinking about the proposal individually. They get together as a council. The proposer of the SIP itself actually has a session where they present their proposal to the council. They also have an opportunity to discuss it with the person who's proposed, and also amongst themselves. And then they essentially justify a decision, communicate a decision, as well as obviously vote on that decision. So that's kind of the mechanism around how proposals are submitted and then proposals are voted on, which is fairly unique. I think the way that it all comes together is fairly unique. Some of the things that, some of the objectives that we had in mind when we were sort of thinking through the best structure for the protocol were, how do we encourage as much participation as possible? We think that leads to better decision making, sort of a better opportunity to capture high value people who kind of can kind of come in and contribute in various ways, and create sort of an element of sort of network effects. The other important thing for us was, how do we create an environment that is fair? Now, fair is a very loose term. It's a very broad term, but we tried our best to kind of try to think about what that means. And also the other element was, what does a participant mean, right? There are different ways that people can contribute and engage with the protocol. Some people will engage economically, so they'll have some sort of economic interest, i.e. holding a lot of tokens, i.e. being a large liquidity provider, something along those lines where they have a direct economic interest, and obviously those are very important stakeholders. Others are socially engaged, so others are participating less economically, but are very, very active, are very involved in spreading ideas, talking about ideas, potentially even creating a sense of community. And then you've got other people that are contributing IP of some sort. So they're, either very specialized in a certain area and contribute, but again, maybe they're not very large token holders, and maybe they're not super active, but that they contribute in ways that are quite sporadic. And so that was kind of the way that we thought around participation and fairness. And again, things like quadratic voting, sort of some type of representative democracy, we thought was a good combination of some of those. And the last aspect was, how do we create a backstop or multiple backstops so that the protocol can't be sort of attacked from a governance perspective, or that malicious behavior is minimized. And so that was something that is obviously important as well. And it's a hard balance. It's a super difficult balance to have. And no doubt, the things that we've done aren't perfect, and I'm sure there'll be challenges down the road that potentially we could have avoided with, certain trade-offs that maybe we have made that we shouldn't have. And I'm sure there's other very good things that are happening that are kind of emerging out of this structure as well. So I might just pause there in case you want to go in a certain direction, but that's, I think, a fairly good overview of where we are and how we got here.
Maybe while people are thinking, Jordan, I'm really curious about this, the representative democracy model, right? Because it almost sounds like the opposite of what Stani was just saying. He says that governance is a cost. And here we're kind of like talking about people as assets of the community and like contributing their brain power and social and so on, and kind of like rewarding them in a way with these positions. So this, of course, the trade-off, we can imagine it could be going down like what democracy has, right? Some sort of populism, or people need to kind of like be educated enough to elect the right people. How do you know these people are qualified and so on? So how do you approach this kind of trade-off, and how is it working out so far?
Yeah, so I guess some things that are very obvious to us that might not be obvious to those on the outside is, or are, it's much more difficult to make decisions when you start to involve 5 times more people, 10 times more people through these various DAOs. And so the propagation of information, the ability to be on the same page about certain ideas, proposals becomes a little bit more difficult. So one thing that has happened is I feel like we have slowed down somewhat, because we are just by definition going through more layers and levels of kind of governance and decision making, and people need to be kept up to speed. The flip side of that is, you do have a wider set of contributors, and they have a vested interest in a way that they wouldn't if they were just proposing, on 50% of each of these votes. We've essentially expanded the team, even though we don't use that term anymore, by incentivizing people to want to be on the council, for example, or on the GDAO. We incentivize them through compensation. We believe that these people are contributing their time, their resources, their energy, and they should be compensated. And what we've done is that we've added, you could argue we've added like 20 people to, again, we don't like to use the term team, but the old definition of team. We've added a number of people that are really spending a lot of time and energy on thinking about what we're doing, on measuring things, on analyzing things, etc. So it does create surface area for people to engage, and I think it's different surface area to just saying, hey, you've got some tokens and we want you to vote every week or every fortnight on certain proposals that we present to you. And so it's been amazing. But also, like I said, it comes with its own challenges.
Certainly. And of course, we need kind of everyone to experiment with different approaches. And it's certainly working so far. So these different archetypes could emerge as like multiple workable strategies, right? If I may just call on Arthur, because I know you've been a long time kind of involved in the community, right? Would you like to kind of ask a question or comment here?
No, I think this Synthetix is probably one of the most successful in decentralizing the governance power among all the top DeFi protocol. It's not very often where you see the core, the founder himself have no decision-making power in the protocol anymore, either in an implicit or explicit manner. And I think that we also have witnessed a few time that Kane's decision are actually it's not aligned with the community, and he was actually vetoed against in that kind of decision. I mean, so I think that kind of proves the how decentralized it is, and I think that there's a reason it's called DeFi, right? So I think that there is a lot of project chasing short-term gains in a way that by moving faster. I mean, definitely every project need to make their own decision, but decentralizing a protocol has to be on the roadmap and has to be paid a sufficient attention to make sure that it's not something that you just forever kicking the can down the road. So yeah, I think that that's something fairly important, and I think Synthetix is definitely leading in that regards. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, it was actually very scary to do some of these things, and credit to Kane. He has always had this vision of getting to this place, and we're not at a final destination, but we're obviously along the way. I was much more worried about some of these moves and some of these ways of decentralizing, because it's scary, right? Like one day you have some control and the next day you have less control, right? And generally as humans, we believe being in control is a good thing, because we're all benevolent and we all make good decisions and all the rest of it. So it's been emotional, like it's an emotional thing. It's not just logical, right? It's not just this is what we need to do, but it takes a level of letting go to even be able to do those things. And I think that that credit needs to go to Kane for really pushing things. Even when we were super busy and we had no bandwidth, he always carved out time to think about this and start preparing and creating the structures to even be here, right? Because this has been like a easy and 18-month process for us, right? And it's not like we had a lot of bandwidth to set aside and do it. We had to do it alongside building shit and moving fast and the craziness of DeFi. So yeah, it is important, as Arthur said, that you don't kick it down, you don't kick the can down the road too long, because it can also become a competitive advantage.
Thank you so much, Jordan. So thanks to Stani and Jordan for going deep into the case studies. Like now we want to go around the roundtable for everyone to also kind of share their experience and their views around these different parts, drawing upon your own experience in involving in governance or setting up some sort of governance process. So next we'd like to invite Anjan from ParaFi, and we know ParaFi has been really active in quite a few key proposals around some of the significant protocols as well. So Anjan, over to you on sharing your experience of, how was it like kind of going through these governance steps and mechanisms? What are some trade-offs that you see and experience that you have and perspectives on where we are and how maybe we can improve?
Sure. Hey everyone, Anjan here from ParaFi. Great to be here. Yeah, maybe I can just start super high level. So as a firm, we spend basically all our time looking at the DeFi space, but I think what's really interesting about DeFi is it's tough to be a passive investor, right? I think it really the space as a whole requires you to be active, both as a user and a governance participant. So whether that's providing liquidity, using the protocol, or just in general, actively participating in governance, pushing out proposals, voting on, on-chain votes. it seems like that's actually how you drive value to the protocol and help the protocol move forward. So, we've been active in a number of communities, including MakerDAO, Aave, Yearn, and over the years, we've seen a number of things work and not work. And what's really interesting, we're kind of seeing governance 2.0 right now, where some of these newer protocols are taking what's been working so far and putting it into their new governance processes. So really seeing kind of an iteration of the whole governance process, which is very healthy to see. Maybe just starting high level, what we've seen work really well, and I guess really improve over time is we think a lot about kind of scaling the governance process. So what that means is, all these DeFi protocols are becoming more and more complex, right? And that means they require more and more active support, participation, involvement from the community, but that's difficult to scale over time as a number of, assets or risk parameters or things to vote on and generally, increase. So what we like to think about is, how do you scale a governance process where, as the complexity of the system increases, you're not losing the engagement or really the involvement from the community. And so something that we're fans of is delegation. So, right now, or really in 2019 and early 2020, the idea was kind of everyone votes on everything. That's the goal. But you always saw very low voter turnout, between like 1% and 5% for a lot of these protocols. And I think the reason for that is because people weren't fully aware or informed of what's going on. And it's kind of an unrealistic expectation to have all token holders informed for all votes and expect them to vote on everything. So what happens is there's somewhat of a tragedy of the commons where most token holders don't know what's going on. They think there's other token holders actually staying up to date, and then they end up kind of passing and choosing not to vote. But that's actually detrimental to the system, because now you only have 1 or 5% of the supply or holders actively voting and pushing out proposals. So we're big fans of delegation. So we've seen Aave, Compound, Uniswap come out the gate with this type of delegation proposal. MakerDAO is working on this as well. And I think what this does is this starts to really put the governance and voting power into the hands of the smartest people. And I think that could be independent researchers, developers, risk analysts, funds, teams. I think the goal really is to get a diverse set of opinions, but we need full-time active participants looking at this governance, at the governance processes and voting and suggesting proposals, not people doing it part-time. Because I think, DeFi today, as it scales from here to another 100x, the weight and gravity of what these DeFi protocols are doing is going to grow immensely. And it's not feasible for, people to just spend a few hours a week or just part-time looking at a governance of the protocol. We need people full-time looking at these risk parameters in real time and pushing out changes. And that's really only going to happen with delegation. And so the way we've been thinking about it is, for example, maybe with MakerDAO, maybe you have like a few dozen, risk analysts, researchers, funds who end up controlling a lot of the voting power. And then all of the major investors and team, foundation, whoever may be, delegate to those individuals. And now those individuals can actually start to vote on these processes with informed opinions, because they're spending most or all their time on these protocols. And so I think that would give the protocol a lot of leverage versus kind of expecting all token holders to vote on everything. I think what's also worked is we've seen the level of community involvement really step up. So in 2019 and I would say in the early parts of 2020, protocols were decentralized. But what does that really mean if the team is the one putting out proposals or pushing through governance processes? But what we've seen now is these DAOs have matured significantly. So if you look at any governance Discord or discourse forum, snapshot, whatever it may be, you see a lot of community members actually pushing out proposals, chiming in, giving their opinions, which I think is a great natural step for governance as a whole, because now you're not completely reliant on a centralized team. So for example, one of these top DeFi protocols that's really fascinating is the core team could step away. I'm not saying they would, of course, but they could step away and the protocol would still run. That's like an incredibly powerful tool, which I think will continue to improve over time. So I think it's really just giving the community the tools and the infrastructure for them to run these processes, and making sure the right actors are in place to actually, run these processes from start to finish. And so as I look across the ecosystem, MakerDAO, for example, the foundation is barely involved with the protocol. You have, 5 to 6 working groups across smart contract, risk, finance, etc., all managing the protocol. And the token holders voted individual people to now serve on these committees. That to me is a very positive signal on where governance is headed. Something else that I've seen that's worked is the tooling is continuing to improve. It's a little bit fragmented, but with stuff like snapshot, delegation, I guess just the form structures, tally, all of these kind of pieces for the governance process are coming together. So, there are different tools. If let's say you want to put a proposal on chain, or you want to vote without gas, or you want to reach an audience of all token holders, you now have all these tools to actually do that. And there's a lot more of a process in place, which I think is a very healthy improvement. So, Aave has the AIP process, Maker has the MIP process. And so if you want to push a proposal through, you now have an idea of what you actually have to do. Token holders may not agree with it. It may not be easy, but at least there's a process in place to push out a proposal. As I think about maybe like the areas that I think governance and DAOs in general are still looking to improve, or I think where there's area to improvement is in general, a little bit on the organization side. So as these centralized teams play less of a role in managing these protocols, it now falls in the hands of individual token holders to manage the protocol, right? But with individual token holders, there can be less organization because there isn't a centralized team or hierarchy managing workflows. And so sometimes you see in these DAOs, it's not exactly clear who's working on what's the status of this particular proposal. And so without that organization, things just fall through the crack and don't get pushed through. And so I think as we continue to see more organization, like the Index Coop and MakerDAO have very kind of clear working groups, and here are the people working on these assignments, here are the deadlines. I think that starts to really improve the functionality and efficiency of the DAO, or else people kind of just put out a proposal and it's kind of floating through the metaverse, and it's not really clear who's actually pushing it through. I think in general, we'd like to see a lot more of a data-driven approach. So, I think it does feel like sometimes risk parameters and various DeFi protocols are changed a little bit finger in the air, kind of on the whim. But there isn't as much kind of deep, analysis of the data or the activity in the systems to really justify those changes. So I think and again, this goes back to the fact of, can we bring in more independent researchers to look at these systems full time, to then provide these data-driven analyses so that token holders can vote in a more informed manner, in a more objective manner, versus something that's a little bit more subjective or finger in the air. I also think, governance as a whole it can be a feature, but it can also be a bug, right? And so what I mean by that is, as the protocols get more and more complex, there's more and more parameters to work on, to vote on, it can actually start to slow down the entire governance process, right? Because if every little change in the protocol needs to be voted on, that starts to distract away from the big changes that need to happen, because governance treats all changes basically equal, right? It's like you need to vote on all these changes. So the more automation we can implement into these systems where it makes sense, I think that goes a long way. So a concrete example is in MakerDAO, you have something called the instant access module, which is this governance tool which allows you to upgrade the system basically in an automatic manner. So for example, when the debt ceiling reaches a certain threshold, the system automatically increases the debt ceiling. So that's one less kind of vote MakerDAO holders have to vote on, which I think is extremely powerful. And I think we'll start to see more and more automation. And that way token holders in the community can focus on the truly high impact subjective proposals that can't be necessarily automated. And I think in general, like a lot of governance is just being informed, staying up to date, right? And as a token holder, it can be time consuming to go through all these proposals, understand what's going on. And I think if we just have a little bit more transparency and organization in terms of the activities of these DAOs and DeFi protocols, I think that goes a long way. So even like a simple newsletter, weekly newsletter to the community, hey, here's what's going on in the protocol, here are the key metrics, here are the ongoing governance proposals. It's not necessarily saying you should vote this way or not, but it's at least keeping the community informed in a concise manner. Because if you just go to a discourse forum, I mean, there's going to be dozens of posts and dozens of responses. It can be very time consuming to go and comb through all of that. And again, this goes back to the scalability, which is how do you get the more passive holder involved, without requiring them to spend 10, 15 hours a week looking at one protocol's governance process. And then I think stuff like, snapshot and tally are definitely helping with this governance process as well. I guess as it relates to kind of the process and from a process and tools perspective, I guess from our experience, we've put through a number of proposals on Aave and Yearn. I think what we found that really works is putting out, forum posts and then letting the community really chime in. Discord can also be a great tool. It does get a little bit noisy at times. There's just a lot of back and forth, but I noticed in the forums, there's typically just been very thoughtful and insightful responses to a lot of the governance proposals that I've seen across the ecosystem. So, we're big fans of the governance forums themselves. And then I think doing stuff like community calls goes a long way. So for example, with MakerDAO, you could post something, you can post a collateral application, and the team that would like to be added as collateral can now come and present to the MakerDAO community. So that kind of tooling there is also very helpful. I think a protocol that really stood out in terms of their, a few protocols really stand out in terms of their process. I think Index Group, considering how young Index Group is, I mean, it really started picking up in August or in September, and considering how organized they've gotten so quickly, that stood out to me, right? They have like working groups and leaders working on clear tasks. They have compensation committees. It's just run very efficiently, and the set protocol team is barely involved compared to all of these index community members, many of whom have anonymous names. You don't actually know who they are. That to me really stood out. In MakerDAO, there's an individual named Long for Wisdom who's been absolutely crushing it in the governance process. I mean, he's the governance facilitator, and he's running dozen plus processes at any time. He's following up with core stakeholders, teams. So he's been a governance all-star, and I think every protocol is probably going to look for their own Long for Wisdom in the future. So on our end, we've put out a few kind of notable proposals in the Yearn and Aave community. I mean, more recently on the Aave community, we pushed for the liquidity mining proposal, just introducing liquidity mining rewards for Aave. Really the thinking there was, let's experiment with liquidity mining. This isn't an end all be all. It's not going to be perfect to start, but let's at least test it out. And so that was the goal there, by just putting out an initial proposal, getting the feedback from the community, talking to other investors, talking to the team, talking to large users, and then kind of then aggregating all of those views into one succinct governance proposal, liquidity mining proposal, where you're providing Aave for different markets. And so we went back and forth on, well, how much Aave, which markets, how long should the program be? What's the structure of the distribution? Do you do Aave? Do you do staked Aave? All these kind of core parameters is something we're thinking about. What I'm looking forward to next is, as this program ends this summer, now we can look back at 3 months of data. And again, this goes back to the data-driven approach and see what actually worked and what didn't. Did we achieve the KPIs we wanted to? Why or why not? Now, moving forward, how do we adjust that? Which markets do we need to incentivize? How do we adjust the distribution? Maybe we stop the distribution completely. Maybe we increase it by 2x. All these kind of core questions is something we like to think about as we push a proposal, but then continue to monitor it.
Yeah, I think there is one question around re-centralizing if we have delegation. So does that put power back into the hands of a few? If we need like a quick answer so that we can get around the round table.
Yeah, sure. So I think in general, with delegation, you're getting, you're putting voting power, quote unquote, in the hands of a few people. But that's arguably better than what you're seeing today, which is still, again, 1 to 5% of the supplier token holders are the ones voting on every governance proposal today. If you look at voter turnout, it's very, very low. So it's not like we're having a lot of governance, a lot of different participants voting today. It's a very low amount. And so what the idea of delegation is, now every participant is now incentivized to delegate their tokens to the kind of sharpest and most thoughtful, people in the ecosystem, whether it's funds, team members, researchers, and then if they're not thoughtful, or if you think they voted against your views, you can easily redelegate to someone else. So you still maintain control of your voting power, but you're giving it to people who are now informed and spending more of their time in the ecosystem, which is a win-win, I think, for the protocol as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anjan. There's a lot to digest there and a lot of great experience to learn from. I think for ourselves as well at Long Hash Ventures, I think some of our portfolio companies, we've been trying to be more involved with the working groups, right, with the proposals, for example, of Idle Finance with their long-term liquidity program. And we can certainly appreciate how much kind of effort goes into, talking to different stakeholders and needing to work with people who are going to build it, people who are going to check the risk parameters, who are going to do the modeling and then actually implement it and then monitor for the results in the longer term. So thanks for Anjan, very much resonate with that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjan. And then so moving on as well, we know Arthur from Defiance, the whole thesis of Defiance is actually being activist investors, right, in DeFi. So I'm sure there's a lot to share, and yourself as well, even before starting Defiance, we understand you have been an active community member. So really looking forward to your sharing, Arthur.
Sure. Actually, right now, I don't really use the term activist anymore because I think that the connotations have certain element of like the negative aspect to it due to the way it's being used in the traditional finance. So I usually just use the term active participation. I think governance is actually a very broad topic, and I don't think we have really solved it yet. So I think just want to quickly talk about like my experience with the governance at early days at Synthetix. I think that point of time, although the process wasn't formalized, but due to the alignment of the community toward the same objective, it works very well just by using a Discord voting. And I mean, it's not binding, and you do not even know whether that the address is that the user is actually behind a certain token holder as well. But you can't know whether these people, how committed they are to the protocol based on their interaction with the community in the Discord channel. So I think that that worked very well, and the protocol also gradually improved along the way to the level that the vote is tied in with the token holder, and right now it's evolved to a council base where, because Synthetix is a fairly complicated protocol, so most of the people, even for myself, I probably would not know as much compared to some of the community members that are like using the product on a daily basis and interacting with the product very frequently. So I think that model, I think right now is indeed the most optimal for Synthetix, and I think that despite all the ideal thinking about DAO is gonna solve a lot of the governance issue, I think that we look at the real world, like a direct one-to-one participation democracy doesn't work that well simply because of information asymmetry. Most people are just too busy to are fully informed about what they are voting for. So I think that a combination of council-based governance or delegation is definitely the way to go. And I think Synthetix has been doing quite well in that regards. And in terms of which one I would say is more sustainable, I think it's definitely back to this. I think that you really need to have a group of community members that is very knowledgeable about the protocol, and these community members will slowly evolve to be the kind of like the community leader of this protocol. And as a result of this, they will gain more trust, and likely that they will garner a lot more votes to help to govern the protocol. I think that has been the case, and voter apathy is real in everywhere. Like when you look at politics, voting for the general elections, or even down to the listed company, the shareholder votings, it's always been fairly low, because when your ownership is below a certain threshold, it actually, from a economic point of view, it doesn't make sense for you to invest so much time and effort to come up with informed decision. So I think that, I think to reinforce what Anjan have mentioned, a delegation or a council-based governance approach, I would say in the long run is a lot more sustainable. But I think it's also very important to cultivate a larger group of community members informed about the protocol, so that you do have other people that can step up in case some of the core community member that decided that there's other things that you would like to focus on, you cannot spend as much time on this anymore. So I think that the larger DeFi protocol generally has done well, and there's a continuous new group of community member that participate in governance. But I think for the younger one, they still need to take some time to grow their informed community member base, so that it's not too reliant on a certain member. And I think that in terms of experience from the initial discussion in the governance channel or forums, I think so far that has been working well, but I think that a lot of time, I think right now the most common one is almost all the protocol have their own governance forum, and most of it have a process already. Like you want to, like Aave have a request for comment, and after that it will get pushed to the AIP if it getting sufficient support. I think the key thing to highlight is to amplify the decision making. I found that some of the protocol, the discussion wasn't well highlighted in the community member. So as a result, sometimes it can be fairly rushed. Like within a week, it went from like a proposal stage to voting station. Actually, a lot of the community member is still not very informed of what is this about, and some might not even know it exists. So we actually encounter this experience. So I think that there is a fairly important to make sure that the community member know that this governance proposal exists and what is it about, so that the discussion permeates into as much people as possible. I think beside that, I think that a lot of the process right now are fairly established. And I think that it's been working quite well, especially from our participation in Aave, Synthetix, and Sushi Swap. Yeah, I think that most of them are like having a pretty good process so far. And I think that in terms of any protocol that stand out, I think Aave have stand out pretty well. I think most of the proposals that have been pushed to the voting stage have all passed. I don't see any votes that have failed so far. And yeah, I think that's the mostly it. I also want to highlight another part that when an investor like us trying to put out a proposal, usually how we get a community support. I think it's very important that you need to think from the community member point of view as well, because if the perceived perception is, this is only just the proposal to enrich the large token holder, even though you have the sufficient vote to brute force vote pass, it's likely not going to end well. So it's usually very important to find a way that to make sure the entire community member is aligned, so that you can also get them to support and participate in the voting as well. And I think that this also comes back to the way of dealing with voter apathy. I think that you also need to give the smaller token holder a sense of participation and their vote matters. So I think in the early days and I think there's a lot of work being done on this regard. I think that especially Vitalik is a very big proponent of quadratic voting. And I think that the Synthetix governance process, when it comes to voting for the council delegate, did introduce some of the quadratic voting, so that the top token holder does not have a one-to-one weight to their vote to choose the delegate for the protocol. I think that this is quite important. I think that, and unfortunately, I think that this is something that is quite lacking. I think most DeFi protocols are still going for one coin, one vote, because I think there are some challenges in implementing quadratic voting, because there is possibility of civil attack, that people creating multiple addresses to increase their influence despite not holding as much token. And they also sort of like another argument that the bigger token holder, since they have more at stake, they will want to act in the best interest of the protocol anyway. So one coin, one vote might not necessarily be a bad thing. But I would say that generally to deal with voter apathies and low level of engagement, it's very important to let the smaller token holder feel that their participation matters, and it's not like that the bigger token holder is the one deciding everything. Yeah. So I think that has been our experience so far. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arthur. And anyone, please jump in with your questions. I'd love to just dive a bit deeper into the idea of quadratic voting, because I think everyone has kind of mentioned this, right? Like you mentioned the civil attack risk. Have you seen it kind of play out? Are there any examples to learn from in that case? Or, is it just not worth the trouble for proposals and yet?
I think we haven't seen it play out because there's just not that many protocol that implemented quadratic voting. Gitcoin is the only one that have the quadratic voting for their funding rounds. And I think that it has not been a major issue because I think that the effort is quite significant. And I think the value at stake is not big enough to trigger a very big civil attack yet. But I'm sure that if a DeFi protocol come to a stage where there's like a multi-million dollar worth of value at stake, such as, for example, Aave is voting for the AIP to add new assets. Let's say there's a quadratic voting. There might be some very obscure illiquid asset they might want to be added, and they might civil attack this because by being added to Aave protocol, they enable them, they increase the utility significantly and also get a lot of recognition as well. So I think that with the value of the decision at stake increase, we are likely going to see this happening. But so far, it has not happened yet.
Yeah, I guess that's also why the guardrails of, like the Guardian Council for like Aave and maybe some sort of veto rights by some sort of council may make sense, right, to counter this. Yeah,
absolutely.
Sure. Now we want to actually move to kind of like the spotlight to some of our ADN members, Balancer, kind of Acala and Instadapp as well. But right before that, maybe if I can just call upon both, I think, Arthur and Anjan to just share a bit more about kind of the role of investors, right? Because we heard about from the project side, but then from the community side, how do we think about like, there are full-time community members who may be council members or like they kind of get compensated. And then there's kind of like people who are involved in, limited, very, very kind of rarely and just votes. And then there's kind of like investors in between that, we come in for certain proposals, but we are not able to kind of commit full time to one protocol only or only a few, right? So how do we kind of like balance the time? What is the level of involvement and role of investors in governance, you think?
Probably I'll start. I would say that as an investor, I mean, for Defiance side, we think it's our duty to be informed, of at least aware of all the major proposal and develop an opinion on it. If we do not develop an opinion or view on it, then we might not vote. But if we do have an opinion, we usually will participate in the voting. Yeah, especially where our vote matters. Our vote is required to pass a quorum. Then usually we will get participated. But generally, we are informed and aware of the governance proposal. Just that we might not participate for, let's say we do not have a very strong view and our participation is not required, then we might not participate.
Yeah, no, I definitely resonate with that. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think it's less of a binary decision and it's more of a spectrum. So, what is actually being involved with governance and what's not being involved with governance, it's tricky to say. So I think the role of an investor, it varies a lot by the type of firm you are and how active you want to be. But I think in general, something that maybe we can all agree on is investors should be involved in some capacity. So maybe it's not voting, but it's, helping find talent, right? There's like multiple ways to be involved. But I think on the governance side specifically, there is a base level, I guess, of, being informed and staying up to date on a lot of these proposals I think is required. And if you feel like as a fund, you're not able to do that, I think it's very important to delegate, if the protocol has a capacity, to people that are more informed. And I think we'll start to see every major DeFi protocol launch delegation. And so I think really the answer is should be involved yourself, but if not, you should understand you have a massive responsibility to the protocol and you should give your voting power to someone who you think can be involved.
Can I just point on that directly? So should investors become like large delegates who attract plenty of delegation of votes then?
Well, no, I mean, I think it depends on the investor themselves. And I think it's really up to the other token holders and community members to decide that, right? Like, I think what I'm excited about is basically seeing a governance like marketplace arena, really where people are competing for voting power. And it's really just the best ideas win, right? And so, some investors are going to be more informed than others. I think they'll attract more votes. But just because you are an investor, I don't think that necessarily means you should have a large amount of voting power. It should be, what's been your track record? Have you been voting? Have you put out good proposals? Because I could argue there are individual researchers, right, who have put out amazing proposals and are driving a lot of value in the governance community. And then there are other fairly large investors who have never touched their tokens, right? So I think just because you are an investor doesn't mean you should be a large recipient of these voting power. It should be based on what ideas you bring to the table, what's been your track record, and what's your governance plan moving forward.
Right. Thank you, Anjan. And thank you, Arthur, again, for your sharing. Super insightful. So here we'd like to talk about your decentralization journey and hopefully kind of like make it a bit more of an open conversation as well, right? So kind of where we are at now, what we are thinking about and the considerations. And then we can invite people around at the round table to also chip in because Jordan is still around, Anjan and Arthur are still around. And of course, our fellow projects here and peers here are all kind of like on the similar journey. So we'd love to invite Kristen and Marta from Balancer.
Hey, everyone. So I'll kick us off. A huge thank you to Longhash for putting this on and everything you're doing. So offering my introduction, I'm Kristen Stone. At Balancer Labs, I hold the role of COO. And I think thought a lot about organization. And then Marta over here does a lot of the decentralization.
Yeah, I'm head of community with Balancer.
So I'll just frame a little bit about Balancer. Although it's a strong name in DeFi, Balancer Labs has only existed since March of 2020. That's 15 months. I was looking up some of the other projects here that have been around since 2017. So in comparison, it actually feels like Balancer is pretty early in our days of iteration. The current protocol's organization is fairly simple. We have Balancer Labs, which is the entity whose mandate is to do what is in the best interest of the protocol. And then we have the community who forms discussions on Discord, discourse, and completes votes on Snapshot, very similar to other projects. Within the community, something Marta has thought a lot about, there's a group of more engaged members we call the Ballers. This really came about in a grassroots way, where members of the community were providing more support, becoming labeled as Ballers, and the program's evolving, which Marta can speak a little more about. There's volunteer tags and people who we view as, yeah, these are trusted parties and it's good to trust them around the community.
That the biggest question I think I have is how do we get people to care and when do we know that we have the decentralized autonomous community that is driving the protocol? When is it, is it the number of people that are voting? Is it the number of proposals being made? There are so many metrics, and I'm wondering which of them are valuable and which of them we as Balancer that are thinking at the beginning of that journey, we should be focusing on.
One of the metrics that we look for, which is a little more qualitative, is actually how many participants do we get in our monthly governance calls? How many, we've had up to, I don't know, maybe like 120, 130 people on a governance call versus early on where we had maybe 20. We probably started off with about 20 outside of the team. So that's always an interesting one for me. It's a combination of how excited people are about what's happening and also if there are any contentious things that are going to be discussed, but also I think a sign of engagement.
Thanks, Kristen and Marta. Next, Ruitao, would you like to share about Acala? And I think there's a little bit of other context and nuance to bring in as well, right? Because Acala being built on Polkadot and Substrate, like the upgradability and like the more on-chain governance being built in is a bit of a special circumstance, right? So we'd love to hear kind of like where you are at and any conversation topics you'd like to raise.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to make it clear that we actually haven't go live yet. So there's the progress that we have to go from 0 to go live. And I would like to share the journey that we foresee of like how we actually build a ParaFi, a specialized network on Polkadot. And I'm going to share some of like some unique characteristic of like governance on either ParaFi or on Polkadot. So first is the Acala is a specialized network, a ParaFi built on top of Polkadot. And for a prominent project or for any influential project in Polkadot, the way to obtain a ParaFi slot It's actually already a decentralization process, I would say. A project will go through a process called a ParaFi offering, or we call it crowd launch, essentially ask community members support in order to obtain slots on the Polkadot network, because there's going to limited number of slots available. So this is already like a decentralized process from the very beginning. The dot holder decides which project will go live, depends on the product that the dot holder see fit. And as we're speaking, the Acala deployment on Kusama is actually happening right now. The crowd launch is actually happening right now. We reach over 100 million value locked in our crowd launch, and the crowd launch is going to last for 7 days, and hopefully by then we can participate in the auction, and then we can start to go live on Kusama. And to launch a specialized network on Kusama, on Polkadot, is actually quite a journey. So we will go through a POA post phase, and gradually giving out the community, the control back to the community. You can see that once we launch the network, the network genesis, actually the balance transfer, all the core module is disabled, and we will appoint ourselves as the council member, essentially the directors of the network, and then we will gradually enable the functionality one by one until to a point that we will remove the admin key, which we call the sudo module. And then once we remove the admin key, then we will then enable balance transfer, enable the core functionality, enable the DEX, enable all the protocol that we built. And ultimately, the final giveaway of the control is to enable election, which essentially remove ourselves from the appointed council members to an elected council members. And ultimately, if we have a diversified council members, then we'll call ourselves that's the very first step towards decentralization. And we actually have a number of different, we say, councils. So there's a general council, there's a financial council that look after the financial instrument parameters. There's also a technical councils. You can think of those as sub-DAOs that have different roles in the network. Some councils are elected by the token holders. Some councils are actually appointed by the general council. So it's actually a lot of going on how we run the election process on-chain. So, and by talking through this, the idea about this council, I would like actually to share one unique characteristic of like this council election. So council election is very similar to token delegation, to voting delegation, but actually it's one step deeper. So to elect a council is actually very similar to a single transferable vote on the current conventional voting system. So you don't delegate as a token holder, you don't delegate your token to only one individual. Instead you choose a set of individuals that you find, you trust, and you delegate those tokens to. And ultimately, the system will elect a set of representative councils based on the rule of single transferable votes. So essentially, the one that gets the highest vote will be elected council, and then your second preference is not wasted. It goes to elect to the second council, and so on and so on. And let's say that there's like 16 seats on the council on the board. You can choose up to 5. You can choose up to 16. It's up to your preference to choose how many council members you elect for. And this is actually how the Polkadot council runs. So you can see that you can vote for like 7, or you vote for 3 preferred council member that's running for the elections, and the election happen every day. And I think that's one key unique characteristic of like how the election is very different on the ParaFi and on the Polkadot ecosystem. This essentially give a much more fair representation on how the final council seat looks like, and it also adjusts some of the voter turnout rate issue or things like that, because like the council who get elected is a fair representation of the token holders' preference on who actually have the governance. The second unique characteristic of like ParaFi or the Polkadot network is that there's one thing called referendum. So any token holder can actually post a referendum. Well, there's actually going to limited amount of referendum per era, which is like per month. But any token holder can pass a referendum, and that means the actual network is actually still in control of token holders. You can propose a silly referendum proposal. It's unlikely to get passed, or it's unlikely to go through the discussion table, but it's actually possible. The council member is there just to steer and to accelerate the referendum race by token holder. And I think the final unique characteristic of Polkadot or Parachain is that the actual chain code, the actual code running on the blockchain is set by the governance. So if you're thinking about a smart contract on Ethereum, it's very easy to have like proxy contract to upgrade the contract itself. That's fairly easy. But if you're thinking about a layer 1 network or a Polkadot, we would call it a layer 0 network. So far, it's the only network that we see that has ability to say that actually it is actually the token holder to decide how the next version of network is going to be like. So essentially, the network code itself is governed by the token holder itself. So we call this process an on-chain upgrade. So essentially, the blockchain runs the code from its in order to upgrade to the next version. The blockchain with the token holder will propose what is the goal, what's going to look like for the next version of the blockchain, and the code is actually executed on-chain.
I think in the interest of time, I'd love to pass it on now to Samyak, who has been waiting for almost 2 hours. Thank you for your patience. From Instadapp, and I understand there's an effort to move to some sort of decentralization as well. So we'd love to hear where you're at and what you'd like to discuss with all of us here today.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Samyak from Instadapp, and we will be launching our token and governance this month with our new protocol that we are calling DeFi Smart Layer, which will be a totally new kind of smart accounts with a lot more new functionalities where the governance is a lot more needed because it might affect real users' assets. So till now, like the smart accounts, they were like it's a smart account where like users are using to secure their assets and then doing atomic transaction composabilities and all those kind of things, but they were like very limited. With the new smart account, I would say we introduced one thing that governance can add new functionalities, which we are calling as modules. So there could be possibly infinite amount of modules that governance can enable, and each module will have different kind of functionality for different kinds of users. So which directly affects the user smart account. So I'll give you an example. Like there is a module which is the main module from which owner will interact. Now let's say governance added one more module, which is a flash loan module. So that will enable any users in the ecosystem to borrow assets from any users who is managing their funds on DeFi DSA. So let's say there is a whale user who is managing $1 billion assets on DSA. Then you can actually borrow his assets and use it anywhere in the DeFi to do a flash loan transactions. So currently, like it will enable the deep flash loan liquidity. So basically could be the biggest flash loan in the ecosystem, because let's say if you take the Aave, which is the biggest flash loan right now, it has a capacity of borrowing 200-300 million DAI, because that's the liquidity available in the Aave right now. But if you take MakerDAO, Compound, and Aave all together, then you can access 1 billion DAI liquidity at once. So with DSA, you can access, like if governance enable flash loan module, then anyone can access flash loan from any of the protocols to any users through multiple DSAs, and can do really huge transactions which weren't possible before. So this is just one example how governance can add different kind of module. Now, so this is just one example, and there could be infinite modules. Like one module that we are focusing on is the interoperability between chains. So we'll start with mainnet and Polygon, and in that module, user can connect their smart account, like mainnet smart account to Polygon smart account, and then they could do trustless migration of their debt position, refinancing, or anything. So this is like a module that governance will enable, and then smart account will be able to communicate with different chains, totally trustless. So yeah, and there could be many different modules like Guardian modules, which will help users secure their assets and all those things and connect. So yeah, I mean, so that is the core place where the governance is needed, and governance can also enable fees and all the other different things for protocol revenue in near terms and automations and many other kind of things for managing the position in the best way possible. And as we are growing, we are now currently focusing more on the infrastructure and having contributions from many different ends. So like we have already got like 3 protocols who have built the connectors for themselves, because once they connect to this layer, they have access to all the other big protocols, MakerDAO, Compound, Aave, and they are composable with all the other protocols. So like 3 protocols, good protocols have already built the connectors to connect themselves. Will make them live in next couple of weeks. Then there are like the developers who will be focusing on the modules, which will be team or the external developers who wants to provide value to the Instadapp ecosystem and provide. And then there will be the developers who can build UIs on top of it. So UIs can be an application like, I would say, Argent to provide super secure way to interact with the DeFi, or the UI can be the current Instadapp, which will provide a highly extensible and complex strategies for users to maximize their gains. So it's like they can use different components in different parts, and it's just an infrastructure layer which is very flexible, and infinite things can be added to this layer. So yeah, that's what we are focusing on.
Thank you, Samyak.
Yeah,
really exciting. I think with this, I think we've heard from everyone from the round table. Thank you so much for staying with us till the end. Right before we go, actually, we have some really interesting kind of attendees as well, who I'd love to invite to maybe just come on and say a couple words, like your comments or takeaways from today. Of course, like Emma from Longhash and Remington from Fambushi Capital as well. If you'd like to come and just say a couple words before we all wrap up. And
sure, I can jump in first. Well, thank you so much. I think for all the panelists, all of you guys are kind of like the pioneers of decentralization, whether from the investor perspective or a protocol perspective. And I think the discussion is extremely insightful. And I think the takeaway I got from this whole discussion is I feel there's no standards in decentralization, and it's very hard to measure the degree of decentralization. It's a journey, and there might be different kind of archetypes emerging from this. And I think depending on which approach you're adopting, right, whether it's fully decentralized from day one and every vote counts, or go for quadratic voting and having sub-DAO, I think it's very much experiment and kind of trying to see what works for you. So and also I think there are already lessons that can be learned from the leading protocols, right? Like how Aave has decentralized, how Synthetix has decentralized. So I think, and also looking at comparative other ecosystems like Polkadot, how they've designed everything in a top-down manner, but kind of start implementing on-chain governance from day one. So I feel like there's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas that can be borrowed and also being used to advise the new projects, so they don't have to go through the 18-month journey, right? Maybe on the start, that's the blueprint we can hand to them, and that's precisely the kind of insights we want to get, and we can use that to help to grow this ecosystem. So thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. Super thankful and excited. Rem, you want to say hi?
Hi guys, thanks Shikai. Thanks to all of the panelists. I really came here today to learn, and I think that's one of the most exciting things about this space is sort of that is a continual learning process every day. I mean, I've been in the space for, I guess, 7 by now, but every new day is a continuous learning process. And I think one of my key takeaways from the call and from sort of continuously kind of looking at different protocols, experimenting with governance over the years is that there's no single right answer. There's no sort of one size fits all solution for everyone. And that echoes into the real world as well. I mean, thousands of years into human civilization, I don't think there's the correct answer for what is the right way to govern a nation state, as Anthony mentioned as well. So, but I think one thing that is super interesting about sort of crypto and DeFi is the pace of innovation and the pace of sort of iteration in the community. So whereas in traditional real world countries, it might take decades or centuries to sort of evolve into a newer governing model. Within DeFi, this is something that can take place over days. And if you see something that doesn't work, you switch, you slowly inch towards sort of something that addresses each of the shortcomings one by one. And I think that is kind of the most exciting part for me, sort of seeing everybody in the call today, from Aave to Balancer to Acala and everyone kind of learning their own lessons and iterating at breakneck speeds. And I think that's sort of the potential to iterate and come up with something, with a better way to address sort of this new type of organization, and the way to sort of find a most accepted version of what everybody believes to be fair. That's kind of the most interesting part for me to be sort of to be in the space and learn and see and iterate. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Remington. It's great to have you here. And so I think we kind of have heard from everyone. Thanks so much again for all of you joining us. I think for me as well, I do think that, we're so early in the space, and as everyone has mentioned, there's so much experimentation to be done. And I think at the crux of it, right, something I really feel the vibe and spirit of what everyone's trying to work towards, is that we have this economic coordination mechanism with tokens and with crypto already, and that's already equalizing so much opportunity to participate. And now we're also innovating on the social layer of how power and control is actually being opened up to everyone as well to participate in shaping communities, shaping how people behave and how power is transferred. So this is truly inspiring to me. I really think that the crypto community is at the core of disrupting so many models in the world, and hopefully bring a lot of good to mankind in general, as cliched or grandiose that may sound. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.